This is the audio lecture for Chapter 2 in the Nye text, Technology Matters. And the title of Chapter 2 is, Does Technology Control Us? And as we'll begin to explore here in just a moment, the sort of overarching idea of Chapter 2 is this idea of technological determinism. And I'll talk a little bit in a moment about what technological determinism is and some of the ideas underlying it. But you probably have noticed by now that each of the chapters in the Nye text has as its title a question. And the question that Nye is asking this time is, does technology control us? Now in chapter 1, you will remember, the question was, can we define technology? And you probably also remember that I said, and you will also remember from your reading, that he never really answers that question, not even provisionally, not even tentatively. You'll find more of an answer to the question that forms the chapter title in chapter 2, although you're going to have to read between the lines to a great extent to get your answer to this question as far as Nye feels about it. So he does give an answer, but you're going to have to sort of read between the lines because he doesn't just come out right out and say whether or not he thinks technology controls us. So this idea of technological determinism is at the heart of everything that Nye is talking about in chapter 2. And he does not go into in-depth discussions about this concept the way that he did with some of them in chapter 1. And so that's why I want to make sure to give you a fairly good grounding in this idea, because to a certain extent, what Nye talks about in chapter 2 presupposes some understanding of what technological determinism is. In a nutshell, technological determinism is the idea that technology determines history, that the course of history, the way that history unfolds, is determined by the technologies that humanity has at any given time in history, and that the way that things develop historically are determined to a great extent by that technology. That there is a certain inevitability to the way in which history is going to unfold, given the technologies that exist at any given period in history. Now, this is a concept that is fairly controversial, has been over the years fairly controversial, in which there still is some controversy even today. And one of the things that Nye does in chapter 2 is explore this question of whether or not history does in fact, whether or not technology does in fact determine history, and whether or not we as humans are powerless in the face of the development of technology, or whether or not we do have some power over the development of technology. The concept of technological determinism is sort of a variant or a more specific version of a philosophical concept known as simply determinism. Now, in philosophy, determinism is the idea that not just in terms of technology, but in terms of life in general, everything is preordained. Our fates or our destinies as individuals and as societies are already sort of mapped out, and the unfolding of existence or history is just the fulfillment of whatever that plan is. And determinism as a philosophical concept is usually counterposed or set against the idea of free will. So you maybe have, if you've had a philosophy class at all in the past, you probably have discussed or read about the idea of free will, possibly even as a counterpoint to determinism as a philosophical concept. And so it's just important for you to understand that this idea of technological determinism, as we are learning about it this week, is just something that is a variant of a larger and much more uh, complex or lengthy idea that has existed in philosophy for many, many centuries. And so the idea of technological determinism, whether or not it exists, which is the question that Nye is grappling with in Chapter 2, can be answered with these opposing questions here. Does society or the social context shape technology, or does technology shape society? Now, the second question is the one that would indicate that technological determinism does in fact exist, and that technology does determine history or determine how things unfold. The other idea that is sort of counterpoint to that is that technology is shaped by society, by the social context, by the all of the different things, different kinds of contexts that unfold as history occurs. And so this is a counterpoint between these two questions that is at the heart of this chapter, chapter 2, and which to a certain extent we're going to be grappling with as we explore the ideas in the Nye text and read the Nye text over the course of the entire semester. And I want to suggest this sort of a continuum on which these ideas exist. Now, Nye does not utilize this idea of it being a continuum in chapter 2, and you will not see any sort of a graphic or even a written description of this sort of a continuum, but I thought that it might be useful for you to think about it in terms of it being a continuum. And this continuum is such that technological determinism is at one end of it, and contextualism, or the idea that context shapes technology, is at the other end, as you can see here. The reason why I think it's useful to think of it as a continuum is that there's an area within the middle or between these two positions that stakes out neutrality. Technological determinism and contextualism are not, strictly speaking, a dichotomy in which you have to pick one or the other, or believe that one or the other is the case. You can have a belief that is in the middle, and this is the area here that's labeled neutrality. You can have an understanding or take the belief that it isn't completely one or the other in terms of technological determinism or contextualism, but that a little bit of both, maybe, somewhere in this middle, more neutral area, is really the situation that obtains, or the situation that actually exists in terms of whether or not technology controls us and whether or not technology or context shapes history. So I want to talk a little bit more about this contextual approach, or what in the previous slide was labeled as contextualism. Nye touches relatively briefly on this idea of the contextual approach in this chapter, but he will return to it to an extent at different points over the course of the book, but especially in chapter 4, where he's talking about history. He'll talk about the contextual approach in conjunction with a couple of other approaches. And so one of the reasons why I want to lay some good groundwork here is that you're going to be encountering this idea in quite some depth in chapter 4, but then also to an extent throughout the book, and it sort of ends up being an assumption that Nye deals with throughout the remainder of the text. So this contextual approach in connection with technology argues for the very high level of importance, or the high degree of importance, of the conditions into which new technologies are introduced. Now, new technologies, when they are invented or when they are introduced into society, that is done into a situation where there's a lot of different sorts of conditions that already exist, and into which a new technology or a new technological system has to be incorporated into. And it is this idea that there are these different contexts into which technology is introduced that forms the heart of this contextual approach. Very significant also to the contextual approach is the idea that there are larger systems into which technologies are introduced, and into which they developed, or in which they develop. Now, the idea of context is a little different from the idea of systems. Systems here is talking about a distinct way in which a particular object or technological product fits into other things. For example, the automobile is a particular technological object, but it fits into a larger system of both the manufacturing of the automobile as well as the operation of the automobile, and the road system and other sort of things related to that exist, within which the automobile has to be incorporated. So this idea of systems is very important as well. The light bulb, for another example, was a particular object that was invented by Thomas Edison, but then it needed to fit into, and around it needed to be developed a system of electricity and electrical power, and transfer of electrical power, in order for those light bulbs to really be of any use within people's individual homes or business places and so forth. So this idea of there being larger systems that technological objects or inventions fit into is very significant as well. And then, distinct from the idea of systems, there are different sorts of contexts. There are social contexts, there are historical contexts more broadly, a political context, economic context, which are just the situations that exist or prevail at the time that a technology is developed. And so these sorts of contexts are something that that we are going to be learning about and talking about and reading about over the course of the entire semester. A great deal of what we're going to be doing when we look at individual areas of technology in subsequent chapters of Nye is that we're going to be talking about the contexts, both historical contexts and contemporary contexts today, in which these technologies exist. Now, to a great extent, historians of technology reject the idea of technological determinism, or at least a great many historians of technology reject the idea of technological determinism because of the importance that they see in these contexts and in these systems into which technologies are introduced. Another thing that sort of argues against technological determinism is the idea of unintended consequences. Unintended consequences. This is a subject that Nye discusses briefly, but which is an important one, that when technologies are invented, there are often things that the inventors or the innovators of a technology did not foresee, they did not intend for this to happen when the technology was put into use, but nonetheless, different sorts of things start to happen. And Nye talks about that a little bit in chapter 2, and it is a subject that is going to pop up at different points from time to time throughout the remainder of the Nye text. And Nye does not really talk about it explicitly in connection with the contextual approach in chapter 2, but it's a good, just as in terms of these slides in this lecture, it's a good place to sort of slot it in because it does relate to the contextual approach in terms of being part of the argument that can be made in favor of the contextual approach against the idea of technological determinism. So a good portion of chapter 2, as will be the case with a good portion of most of the chapters here on out, consists of Nye just sort of going through the ideas, discussing and outlining the ideas of a variety of different thinkers on whatever the subject of the chapter is. In this case, in chapter 2, Nye talks about a number of different thinkers and how their ideas relate to this idea of technological determinism. And so I'm just going to briefly go through a few of these thinkers that are prominent in the chapter and introduce them and their ideas. The first of these is Karl Marx, who you probably are aware of and know of in terms of being the founder of the Marxist theory of government and the Marxist philosophy, which of course was adapted adapted to become communism in the early 20th century, and which informed communism during its 70 or so odd year existence between the 1920s and the 1990s in the Soviet Union primarily. Marx started as a philosopher, and in addition to his philosophical ideas related to government and to society, in relation to communes and collective living and so forth, he had a lot of ideas related to technology as well, and technology's role in the struggle of the worker, and technology's interaction with humanity. A lot of what we're going to be doing throughout the semester is going to be dealing with ideas related to the interaction between technology and humanity in terms of our course's emphasis on the humanities. And so you'll read about a number of those ideas as proposed by Karl Marx, the founder of Marxism and the inspiration for 20th century communism. Another thinker, W.F. Ogburn, who was a sociologist in the early and mid 20th century, had some ideas as well that relate to technological determinism that Nye discusses in the chapter. Ogburn proposed this idea that there were both technical inventions and social inventions. Now, technical inventions were inventions in the way that we usually think about inventions. Objects, technological objects such as an automobile or a television or a light bulb or a computer that are invented by somebody and then become objects that are used in our homes or in factories or so forth. Social inventions, on the other hand, are not objects, are not physical objects, but are ideas that did not exist before that, before they were invented by somebody, and they involved new ways of interaction between people or groups of people, or new formations or organizations of people that did not exist before. For instance, the corporation would be a social invention, that there was one point in history where there was no such thing as a corporation in terms of a form of business. And then that form of business was invented and put into practice, and that constituted a social invention. Now, there's a great many connections between social inventions and technical inventions. And with the examples that I've given, you can probably think of connections then between corporations and technical inventions in the form of factory machinery. Corporations that had as their purpose the manufacture of different products would have utilized technical inventions of factory machinery. And so one of the things that Ogburn talks about, that Nye discusses in chapter 2, is the idea that there's influence that flows in both directions between social inventions and technical inventions in terms of the way that Ogburn discussed those ideas. You'll read about a couple of thinkers named Marshall McLuhan and Alvin Toffler that Nye sort of groups together in a discussion of what he calls externalist arguments related to technology. Now here, he's talking about, Nye is referring to particular strains of thinking in these two men that were very strongly technological, that very strongly fit into technological determinism. They were very deterministic when it came to technology, basically arguing that technology develops, is a force that develops on its own, that we have very little control over, in which we as humans are sort of forced to respond to as these technologies develop. And Marshall McLuhan, the ideas that he discussed were related mostly to new forms of media. He wrote a lot about television, a little bit about computers, but primarily broadcasting forms like radio and television, and arguing that that technology sort of constituted a force that we had little control over once it was unleashed and began to develop. Toffler's ideas relate more to what is called futurism and include a variety of different sorts of technology, and the idea that external to the situation in which those technologies develop, they have a force that we have to respond to and are sometimes not powerless to in terms of their development. And then finally, there's a philosopher named Michel Foucault, a French philosopher from the late 20th century, who had quite a number of ideas related to technology as well. And one of them that Nye goes into a little bit of detail in at the very end of chapter 2 is the idea of what Foucault called epistemes. Epistemes. Now, these were thought to be sets of ideas or complexes of ideas that sort of became part of a society, and over which once they did become part of a society and began to grow and develop, that the society and individuals within the society had very little control over. And so you can probably see how that might relate to technological determinism. Foucault had sort of embedded in this idea of epistemes, the idea that technology, ideas related to technology, are part of these complexes of epistemes that can develop and sort of take on a life of their own almost within a society, in which once that happens, we have very little control over. So hopefully this brief introduction that I have given to these thinkers that you'll encounter in the second half of chapter 2 will help you to understand what they're talking about and what Nye talks about in relation to their ideas when you encounter it in the reading. And at the end of chapter 2, Nye sort of teases the following chapter, and in chapter 3, now that the issue of technological determinism has been taken care of and has been discussed, Nye gets into the idea of whether or not technology controls us or we control it. Can technology be predicted, or is it fundamentally unpredictable? And so that will be the subject of chapter 3.